Last Thursday, my wife's brother sat in the lobby outside my office with both hands wrapped around a paper cup he wasn't drinking from, and for a full minute my receptionist thought he was just another nervous applicant. 10 years earlier, that same man had slapped the hood of my rusted pickup at my rehearsal dinner, laughed in my face, and told me his sister was making the biggest mistake of her life because men like me never became anything. He didn't use the word broke. He used the word worthless. And last Thursday, he was sitting under the frosted glass sign that had my name on it, waiting to ask whether I had a place for him in the company he used to call my little maintenance hobby. That was the moment, if I'm being honest, when I understood how long humiliation can stay alive inside a person without making a sound. Because people think anger announces itself. They think if something cuts you deeply enough, everyone in the room should hear it happening. But that isn't how it worked for me. For me, it worked like water through drywall. Slow. Hidden. Quiet. Year after year, comment after comment, holiday after holiday, Russell Whitaker said things that would have started fights in other families. He said them at dinner tables with candles in the middle. He said them in golf shirts with a smile. He said them beside folded napkins, baby gifts, graduation cards, hospital chairs, and church parking lots. He said them in front of my wife, Leah, and in front of their parents, and eventually he said them in front of my daughter too, because that is what contempt does when nobody stops it early. It gets comfortable. It starts acting like furniture. And the worst part was that Russell was never loud enough to sound guilty. He was polished. Careful. Casual. He had the kind of voice that made cruelty sound like common sense. If you had met him for 5 minutes back then, you would have thought he was charming. If you had sat beside him for 5 years, you would have understood what charm turns into when it stops needing witnesses. I saw it from the beginning. I just didn't know, at 28, how expensive it would be to keep telling myself I could absorb it and move on. The Thursday he came in for that meeting, rain was hitting the lower windows of our office in long gray streaks. My building sat on the west edge of the city, just past the older warehouse blocks and the strip of commercial buildings nobody photographs unless they're trying to sell a story about rebirth. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. 3 floors. Operations on the 2nd. Estimating and contracts on the 3rd. Dispatch and fleet on the 1st. 42 field technicians, 6 project managers, an internal training team, and more service vehicles than I used to believe a man like me would ever own on paper. Northline Building Systems. That was the name on the glass. I picked it because it sounded stable. Not flashy. Not clever. Stable. At 28, stability had felt like a fantasy people in sweaters inherited from their fathers. By 38, I had built it with invoices, midnight callouts, bleeding knuckles, second-hand ladders, stubbornness, and the kind of fear you hide by working longer. Russell used to laugh at all of that. Actually, no. That's too soft. He didn't laugh at the work. He laughed at the idea that work like mine could ever matter enough to count. When my receptionist, Anna, buzzed my line and said, "Your 10:30 is here," I stood at my office window and looked down into the lot where the rain had turned the asphalt silver. She didn't know who he was. I'd told her to slot him like any other applicant. No special treatment. No family shortcuts. He had emailed 2 days earlier asking if we could talk. Not catch up. Not get coffee. Talk. That word told me everything. People who want nostalgia say catch up. People who want favors say talk. I asked Donna how he looked. She paused, then said, like he didn't sleep much. Nice suit, though. A little old-fashioned. He brought a folder. A folder. That detail almost made me smile. Russell had spent a decade measuring human worth by polish. Watches. Schools. Neighborhoods. Shoes. The right table at the right restaurant. The right names saved in a phone. And now he was sitting outside my office with a folder in his lap like one of the apprentices who come in hoping to convince us they'll show up on time and learn quickly. I told Anna to give me 5 minutes. The truth is I didn't need 5 minutes to review anything. His resume had arrived by email. I had already read it twice. Regional Sales Director. Business Development Manager. Vice President of Client Strategy at a company that sounded larger than it was. A trail of titles that got longer while the measurable outcomes got thinner. Lots of leadership language. Not much evidence of actually building anything. That, too, felt familiar. Russell always loved titles that hovered above the ground. He liked being near power more than he liked carrying weight. If you want to understand the man, you have to start 10 years before that office lobby, before the folder, before the rain, before Northline, back when the two of us first stood in the same place and realized we had already judged each other. It was the night before my wedding. Leah and I were getting married in early October, one of those clear Midwestern autumn weekends where the air feels scrubbed clean and every tree looks like it agreed to be more beautiful than necessary. The rehearsal dinner was in a private room above a restaurant downtown that Leah's mother loved because the chandeliers looked European and the waiters said things like absolutely and of course without sounding irritated. I remember every detail of that night because humiliation has perfect memory. I was standing outside in the alley side lot behind the restaurant because I had gone down to grab a garment bag out of my truck. I still had the truck I'd bought after trade school, a dark green Ford with a dent over the rear wheel and a heater that only worked when it felt inspired. Leah used to joke that the truck had a personality disorder. I used to joke that at least one of us had transportation. We were happy then. Or at least I believed happiness was what we had when life was still cheap and unfinished. I had met Leah 3 years earlier when she was finishing her degree in speech pathology and I was working days for a mechanical contractor while taking night certification classes in building controls. She had a clean laugh, a mercilessly practical brain, and a way of listening that made you feel like you had said something more interesting than you actually had. I fell hard. She did too, at least hard enough to move into a second-floor apartment with me above a shoe repair store and call it an adventure instead of an address. Her family never called it that. The Whitakers were not old money in the movie sense. There were no horses or summer homes on islands. But they were the kind of family that had enough money for it to become invisible. The kind that treated comfort like oxygen and couldn't understand why anyone would mention it aloud. Her father, Martin, owned 2 medical supply distribution centers and had spent 30 years building a business that made him respected in every room he entered. Her mother, Colleen, chaired charity luncheons and knew which fork to use even when nobody was looking. Their house had a circular driveway and a den nobody was allowed to call a den because apparently it was the library even though nobody read in it. Russell was the eldest. Golden child by training. He was 32 when I met him, 5 years older than Leah, broad-shouldered, careful with his hair, and permanently dressed like he had somewhere else he would rather be. He sold enterprise software then, or at least that's what he said. Most of what I understood was that he traveled just enough to talk about airports and made just enough money to narrate other people's limitations for sport. The first time he shook my hand, he glanced at the calluses on my palm and asked, with a smile so smooth it almost passed for friendliness, if I had considered getting into something with upward mobility. Leah had rolled her eyes. I laughed it off. That became a pattern. At the rehearsal dinner, he caught me by the truck before I could head back inside. He had a whiskey in one hand and no jacket on, tie loosened just enough to suggest confidence without disorder. "Still driving this?" he asked, tapping the hood with 2 fingers. "Still starts," I said. That wasn't the question. I remember the smell of onions from the kitchen vent behind us. I remember music leaking faintly through the brick wall. I remember not yet understanding that some moments decide the emotional weather of the next decade. "Leah says you're thinking about starting your own thing one day," he said. "Maybe." "Doing what?" "Controls work. Commercial service. Maybe energy retrofits if I can get enough steady contracts." He took a sip and looked at me like I had just described a hobby involving model trains. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice in that fake brotherly way men use when they want credit for honesty. "My sister confuses potential with character. She always has. She thinks because somebody works hard, life owes them a runway. It doesn't. And marriage? Marriage is expensive even when you know what you're doing. Men in your lane usually drown in year 3. I said nothing. He smiled. "I don't mean that cruelly," he added, which is how people announce that cruelty is exactly what they mean. "I'm saying you should know what you're stepping into. Leah grew up a certain way. She won't say that because she's sentimental, but she'll feel it. Women always do. And if you can't build a life that matches her standards, she'll spend years pretending not to notice until one day she does." He looked down at my truck again. Then he said it. "Don't take this personally, Daniel, but hardworking and worthwhile aren't the same thing. Plenty of worthless men work very hard." He said it lightly. Like a line tossed into air. Like he was doing me the favor of precision. Worthless. I wish I could tell you I hit him. I wish I could tell you I grabbed his tie, shoved him against the brick, and made the next 10 years impossible for him by ending that pattern before it began. But that isn't what happened. What happened is I stared at him, felt heat climb the back of my neck, and heard the restaurant door open behind us before I found any words worth using. Leah stepped out with my mother. Asking whether I'd found the garment bag. Russell smiled at both of them like the conversation had been about parking. I said yes. And that was how it started. No witness to the line itself. No dramatic scene. Just a word placed quietly between two men, then carried for years by only one of them. The wedding happened the next day. Leo looked stunning and terrified and happy in alternating waves. My mother cried before the vows even started. Martin gave a speech that was generous enough to sound sincere, though he made sure to mention resilience 3 times as if marrying his daughter were an endurance event I had somehow qualified for. Russell was best man because of course he was. He toasted us with practiced warmth, called Leah brilliant and beautiful, called me solid, which felt like the kind of compliment people give concrete, and told a story about me fixing the loose hinge on their guest bathroom during a family barbecue because he apparently thought useful and ornamental should live in the same sentence. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. That became another pattern. If you keep laughing at insults long enough, people start believing that ease is your natural language. Our first apartment as a married couple was 800 square feet above a dentist's office. The floor tilted slightly toward the kitchen. The windows leaked cold air in winter. The bathroom fan sounded like a chainsaw at low speed. We furnished half of it with hand-me-downs and the other half with things we bought because they were on clearance and didn't look diseased. Leah called it our launch pad. I loved her for that. I still do, in some ways that never fully untangled even after the harder years. Back then, I was making decent money for my age but not enough to impress the Whitakers. I ran service calls, learned control systems, took emergency weekend shifts nobody wanted, and saved everything I could. My boots stayed by the door. My phone went off at terrible hours. I came home smelling like dust, metal, and rooftop air. Leah was working long clinic hours at a rehab center and studying for certifications that could move her into pediatric practice. We were busy, tired, hopeful, and too poor to perform our lives for anyone. Russell hated that I didn't seem ashamed of it. The first Thanksgiving after the wedding, he arrived at Martin and Colleen's house in a tailored charcoal coat and handed everyone gifts from some gourmet store where even the jam looked wealthy. Leah and I brought a pie I'd baked badly but honestly. Russell took one look at the cardboard bakery box and asked whether our oven still worked or whether this was one of those rustic attempts people make when they're short on options. Leah said, "Russell, stop." He raised both palms in mock surrender. I'm joking. Daniel knows that. I did know it. That was the problem. I knew the rhythm so well by then that I could feel the sentence before he said it, the way some people hear thunder before the storm gets close. Dinner started smoothly. Colleen wanted family stories. Martin wanted to discuss the market. Russell wanted an audience. He got one when Martin asked how work was going for me and I said the company I worked for had lost a major account, which might end up giving me room to take on more direct controls work. Russell leaned back, cut a piece of turkey, and said, "That's one way to describe instability." I kept chewing. He went on. "You know what I think? I think guys like Daniel get addicted to surviving. Every month is this heroic little rescue operation and they start confusing that with ambition. But if your plan only works as long as nothing bad happens, it isn't a plan. It's just extended luck." Martin glanced at him. Not disapproving. Merely attentive. Russell noticed and smiled wider. "I'm serious," he said. "Leah, you were top of your class. You could have married a surgeon. Or a partner. Or somebody with equity in something besides a toolbox." Silence. Then Colleen, brisk and careful, said, "Russell." Not stop. Just Russell. Like his name itself should cover the damage. I set down my fork and asked Leah where Martin kept the foil. That got a small laugh from the table because they thought I was defusing it. I wasn't. I just knew if I answered honestly, the day would end with Leah crying in the car because everyone would insist Russell was teasing and I was being sensitive. That night on the drive home, Leah apologized for him. She always apologized for him in private and minimized him in public, which is one of those family habits nobody teaches you but people absorb anyway. You don't confront the difficult person. You rearrange everyone else around them. "He doesn't actually think you're worthless," she said softly, eyes on the windshield. I almost asked how she knew. Instead I asked, "Has he ever talked to anyone you respect like that?" She didn't answer for a long time. Then she said, "He talks like that when he feels threatened." I looked out at the dark storefront sliding by and thought, if that's true, why does everyone keep rewarding him for it? But I was newly married, still in love enough to confuse patience with virtue, so I let it go. That was what I did in those years. I let things go until they started collecting. 2 months later, the contractor I worked for folded one division and pushed half of us into a shuffle that left me with fewer hours and more promises than pay. The owner called it restructuring. Everybody in the shop called it panic in a collared shirt. I was at our apartment table with a legal pad, a calculator, and 3 separate versions of fear when I said out loud for the first time that maybe this was the moment to try on my own. Leah had just come home. She still had her clinic badge clipped to her sweater. She set down her bag, looked at the numbers, then looked at me. "Can we survive it?" she asked. Maybe not elegantly. That's not what I asked. I remember smiling because that was exactly why I loved her. She didn't need a fantasy. She needed a boundary. "Yes," I said. "If we cut hard, if you don't mind me taking every ugly call for a while, if I can land 2 maintenance contracts and 1 controls retrofit by spring, yes. We can survive it." She sat down across from me and read through my ugly handwriting as if it were a serious document instead of a tired man's argument with the future. "Then do it," she said. "Just like that." "Not just like that. We make a budget. We cancel what we don't need. We don't buy anything shiny. You stop pretending you're going to be less scared if you wait another year. And if it fails while you're young enough to recover." That was the night Northline existed in theory. Not as a company yet. Not as trucks or payroll or branded jackets. Just as a name on a yellow pad and a decision in a rented apartment where the radiator knocked like a bad tenant. Leah supported me in the practical, exhausting ways that never get included when people tell inspirational business stories later. She packed leftovers into containers so I could spend lunch hours driving to property managers' offices. She answered my calls on speaker while she folded laundry and listened to me talk through pricing. She found mistakes in my first service agreement template because my eyes were crossing by midnight. She let me sell the second car. She let me turn our tiny living room into an office on weekends. She believed before belief had anything to lean on. Russell treated that belief like evidence of her poor judgment. At Christmas that year, after I had officially filed the LLC, printed cheap business cards, and spent nearly everything we had on licensing, insurance, and a used cargo van with one working door, he asked how many employees I had. 1, I said. So you're unemployed with stationery. Martin laughed into his wine. He did it quietly, but he did it. People talk a lot about obvious cruelty because it's easy to identify. The subtler kind is harder to explain later. It hides in the half-second where someone could have corrected the room and chose not to. I told Russell I had 3 bids out and a solid shot at a preventative maintenance contract for a chain of pharmacies. He nodded like I had told him my band finally booked a coffee shop. That's cute, he said. Just promise me you won't drag Leah down with one of those heroic founder fantasies. There's a whole cemetery full of little men who thought grit was a financial strategy. Little men. Worthless. Some insults evolve. Others just change jackets. That first year nearly broke me in 8 separate ways. I worked commercial maintenance calls during the day, programmed controls at night, and took emergency no-heat calls every time winter reminded people how badly buildings behave when ignored. I invoiced from the passenger seat. I ate gas station sandwiches over steering wheels. I learned which clients paid late, which ones lied smoothly, and which property managers pretended to forget your rate until the rooftop unit quit during business hours. I learned the humiliating art of asking for work without sounding desperate. And I learned that competence, when repeated long enough, starts to sound like reputation. By spring, I had the pharmacy contract, 2 mixed-use properties, and a grocery warehouse that needed controls work more often than it admitted. By fall, I was hiring my first full-time technician, a guy named Omar who had steadier hands than I did and zero patience for nonsense. By the end of year 2, I was still not making the kind of money Russell respected, but I was building something that could survive a bad month without borrowing from Leah's savings. That should have changed the family dynamic. It didn't. Success does not soften people who benefited from underestimating you. It only makes them more creative. When Leah got pregnant with our daughter, Emma, Russell congratulated me by asking whether we'd priced diapers into my small business adventure. At the baby shower, he handed us a high-end stroller and made a joke about wanting to contribute something reliable to the child's transportation situation. Everyone laughed again. Leah did not. That was one of the first times I saw something in her expression harden for real. Motherhood changed her relationship to disrespect because suddenly there was someone smaller in the room who might learn from it. Later that evening, after the gifts were opened and the cake was cut and Colleen had told every woman in attendance the story of Leah kicking from inside the womb as if the girl had been practicing personality for decades, Leah found Russell near the patio and told him quietly that if he took one more shot at me during the pregnancy, he could spend the next holiday somewhere else. He looked shocked. Not guilty. Shocked. Because men like Russell always assume the boundary is the offense. For a little while after that, he got smarter. Less direct. More decorative. If I wore a suit to a family event, he asked who dressed me. If I mentioned a new contract, he asked whether it was one of my tiny local ones or something that actually scaled. If Emma had a fever and we left dinner early, he would say things like, "Well, at least Daniel's schedule is flexible." One Easter, while the family was in the kitchen and I was on the back porch fixing the loose latch on Martin's gate because I had apparently developed a tragic condition where I couldn't walk past a broken hinge without dealing with it, Russell stepped outside and leaned against the railing. "You know what's funny?" he said. "I kept tightening the screws. No matter how much money you make, you'll always do this stuff. Fix a latch. Need to be useful physically. Need to prove your hands justify your presence. It's like you don't know how to exist unless somebody has a problem you can solve with a tool." I stood up. He gave me an almost sympathetic look. That's not status, Daniel. That's service. It took me years to realize Russell wasn't only trying to insult me. He was trying to define the world in a way that permanently protected his position in it. If labor was lesser, then people like me stayed beneath people like him no matter what the bank account said. If usefulness was low status, then dependence looked elegant. If building things with your own hands marked you as disposable, then he never had to learn how fragile his own importance really was. Emma was born in late August after 19 hours of labor, 2 scares, and the kind of exhaustion that makes joy feel almost violent when it finally arrives. I held her and thought, with a force that embarrassed me, that I needed to become larger than every insult I had accepted so far, because children hear the shape of your dignity before they understand the language around it. Russell came to the hospital in a pressed blue shirt carrying an arrangement of flowers so expensive it looked like an apology for having a personality. He stood over the bassinet and said Emma had my ears and Leah's chance at a better life. Leah stared at him. What does that mean? She asked. He laughed. Relax. I'm saying she got the best of both of you. Martin, who was by the window checking messages, didn't look up. Colleen adjusted the flowers. I was holding my newborn daughter and trying not to ruin the day by telling a grown man to get out of the room. That was the emotional mathematics of those years. Every ugly moment came attached to collateral damage. Holidays. Births. Funerals. Birthdays. You could confront the offense, but then you also became the man who made the room impossible on a day other people wanted to keep clean. Russell relied on that. So did everyone who kept excusing him. Northline grew anyway. By year 3, I had 6 employees and enough recurring work to rent a legitimate office warehouse space with 2 bays and a front room that smelled faintly of old carpet and determination. By year 4, we had added refrigeration service because a cold storage client begged me to take on the side nobody else could keep staffed. By year 5, I was doing enough emergency response for food distributors, clinics, and light manufacturing sites that I started sleeping with one phone on the nightstand and another by the bed in case dispatch froze. We were not glamorous. We were trusted. That matters more. You learn something important when you build a company that people only remember in a crisis. Almost nobody respects invisible work until the day it stops. The freezer alarms at 2 in the morning. The failed rooftop units during a heat wave. The controls fault that turns a medical storage room into a lawsuit waiting to happen. My company lived inside other people's emergencies. We made buildings behave. We protected inventories, medications, schedules, openings, payrolls, reputations. We were not ornamental. We were structural. Russell still described me at parties as Leah's husband who fixes things. One year, at Martin's 60th birthday dinner, a woman from his country club asked what I did. Before I could answer, Russell said, Daniel's in facilities. Think blue-collar MacGyver with invoices. The table laughed. I said, commercial mechanical service and controls integration. The woman blinked, nodded politely, and asked Martin about his golf trip. That was another thing Russell understood before I did. When someone controls your introduction often enough, they can turn your actual life into a footnote. Leah heard it all. She began correcting him more openly after Emma started talking. By then we also had our son, Miles, a serious little boy with permanent bedhead and the eyes of a child who always seems one step away from asking how something works. Leah became less willing to cushion Russell for the family. She told him to stop in kitchens, on porches, in text threads, and once in the driveway in front of Martin and Colleen after Russell referred to my company as the Van Fleet. He would back off for a week, sometimes a month. Then he'd return with a fresh angle. Successful bullies adapt when their obvious methods stop paying. If they can no longer attack your income, they attack your polish. If they can no longer attack your stability, they attack your taste. If they can no longer attack your work, they attack your origin. Russell loved origin. He loved reminding rooms that I was the son of a bus mechanic and a school cafeteria manager. He loved using my childhood like a cautionary tale nobody had requested. At one family gathering, when someone complimented the house Leah and I had finally bought, modest by Whittaker standards, perfect by ours, Russell ran a hand over the banister and said, "It's amazing what discipline can do." Daniel basically upgraded from functional poverty to respectable middle. I remember Emma, who was 6 then, standing on the stairs in socks, listening. I remember her face. Children don't always understand the content, but they understand when a parent is being diminished. That night I tucked her in and she asked, "Why does Uncle Russell talk to you like you're bad?" That question did something to me no adult insult ever had. Because I could survive being underestimated. What I could not accept anymore was my daughter learning that love means swallowing contempt to keep dinner calm. I said, very carefully, "Sometimes people think being rude makes them look important. It doesn't. It just makes them rude. Why don't you tell him to stop?" I kissed her forehead and said, "I'm working on a better answer than that." At the time, I wasn't sure I believed myself. I thought maybe the better answer would be more success. More distance. More proof. That is the lie a lot of hardworking people fall for. We think if we achieve enough, the disrespect will become irrational even to the people delivering it. But contempt is not a spreadsheet. It doesn't correct itself when the numbers change. Year 7 was the first time I saw a crack in Russell's own life big enough for sunlight to get through. He had bounced from software sales into strategic partnerships, then into commercial development at a branding agency started by a college friend with venture money and good hair. His social media still made him look bulletproof. Better restaurants. Better suits. Better vacations. Better angles. But in person, small things started giving him away. The edge in his voice when Martin asked about quarterly results. The way he drank faster at family dinners. The jokes that landed half a second late because he needed them more than the room did. One evening at Leah's parents' house, I came in from the patio carrying a folded table because the rental chairs had arrived broken and somehow that had become my problem, and I heard Russell in the den talking to Martin with the door cracked. "I told you it's temporary," he snapped. Martin said something lower, too quiet to catch. Russell answered, "I know what my burn rate is. I don't need a lecture." Burn rate. That phrase stayed with me. Not because it was my business. Because Russell only used financial language when he was scared. When I stepped back into the hallway so they wouldn't see me, I realized something I should have understood much earlier. He wasn't mocking my fear because he lacked fear. He was mocking my kind of life because mine had taught me how to survive without illusion, and his hadn't. That didn't make him sympathetic. It made him dangerous in a different way. People who are terrified of falling will sometimes spend years insulting the people who already know how to land. The worst thing Russell ever said to me did not happen at our wedding. It happened 9 years later in front of my son. But before I get to that, you need to understand something about Martin. For all his passivity where Russell was concerned, Martin was not a foolish man. He had built real value in the world. He understood logistics, relationships, margins, and timing. He knew what it meant to make payroll. He knew what it meant to bet correctly on a warehouse location 10 years before the highway expansion made it gold. He also knew, whether he admitted it or not, that I had done something similar in a different lane. By year 8 of my marriage, Martin had stopped asking whether Northline was going to work and started asking about fleet utilization, attrition, and expansion into neighboring counties. Those conversations mostly happened away from Russell. In garages. On patios. In the front seats of parked cars after family events while everyone else was still inside wrapping leftovers. Once, after I helped him troubleshoot a chiller issue at one of his distribution buildings because his property team had been getting fleeced by a vendor for months, he stood with me in the mechanical room and watched the gauges settle. "You know," he said, not looking at me, "I don't think I appreciated early enough what it takes to keep problems from becoming disasters." I wiped my hands on a rag and said, most people don't. If it's working, nobody asks questions. He nodded slowly. Then, after a pause long enough to matter, he said, Russell's always mistaken presentation for capability. I looked at him. That was the closest thing to an apology I ever got from Martin Whittaker. It wasn't enough to repair the years. But it told me he wasn't blind. He had just chosen the easier son for too long. Around that same time, Leah and I started having the conversations couples have when small hurts harden into system problems. We weren't fighting all the time. In some ways that would have been easier. We were functioning. Coordinating schedules. Raising children. Managing a mortgage. Showing up to school conferences and flu seasons and late-night grocery runs and endless laundry. But a marriage can look competent from the outside while one issue keeps chewing through its structure from the inside. For us, the issue was Russell. Not just Russell himself. What he revealed. Leah had defended me more in those later years, yes. She had corrected him, challenged him, once even walked out of Christmas dinner with me and the kids after he made a crack about my contractor hands touching Colleen's antique serving platter. But she still wanted the broader family intact badly enough that every boundary came with an apology attached. I know he was awful, but he's still my brother. I know my parents should say more, but that's just how they've always handled him. I don't want the kids to lose their grandparents because Russell can't regulate himself. Every sentence made practical sense. Every sentence also asked me to pay part of the cost. One night after Emma had gone to a sleepover and Miles was already asleep. Leah found me at the kitchen counter answering emails and said, "Tell me honestly if you're starting to hate my family." I closed the laptop. There are questions in marriage that are really requests for mercy. That was one of them. I don't hate your family, I said. But I don't trust rooms where everyone's comfort depends on me pretending your brother isn't insulting me. She sat down and covered her face with both hands. I know, she whispered. I know. I believed that she knew. What hurt was that knowing had not been enough to change the shape of our lives. The following spring, Colleen slipped on wet stone steps outside a charity event and fractured her ankle badly enough to need surgery. Martin was out of town when it happened. Russell was supposedly unreachable in Napa with clients. Leah called me from the hospital and asked if I could come because the transport team needed somebody to move Colleen's car and coordinate a few things. Of course I went. That is another truth I have learned about dignity. Helping someone in need does not become weakness just because your critics benefit from it too. I handled the paperwork, got the car home, met the locksmith because Colleen had dropped her purse in the scramble, and spent half the next day installing temporary rail supports on the back steps because the front entry was going to be impossible for weeks. When Russell finally showed up, expensive sunglasses on, talking loudly into his phone as if crisis had been scheduled around him rather than the other way around, Colleen hugged him and cried. He kissed her forehead, took over the room socially, and then told Martin within my hearing that at least Daniel was available for handyman triage. Handyman triage. Like the previous 18 hours had been a service package from a mildly useful neighbor. Martin said nothing. Leah heard it and turned white with anger. On the drive home she said, "I should have said something right there." "You should have," I answered. "It came out flatter than I intended." She looked at me like I had just placed a stone between us. Maybe I had. Because there comes a point where the insult is not the only injury. The deeper injury is realizing who will not risk discomfort to protect you from it. We got through that year, but not cleanly. I buried myself even harder in work. Northline landed a municipal service contract, expanded into remote monitoring, and opened a training bay for apprentices who didn't fit the polished recruiting molds larger firms loved. I had started intentionally hiring young men and women who reminded me of myself at 22, bright, rough around the edges, capable, underestimated. People who needed a shot more than a lecture. That program became one of the things I was proudest of. Russell mocked it, naturally. At a 4th of July cookout he referred to it as my rescue kennel for blue-collar strays. Emma heard him. She was 10 by then, old enough to understand tone and brave enough to ask questions in real time. "Why do you always act mean to Dad?" she said from the picnic table. The yard went still. Not loud still. Family still. The kind where forks pause and eyes move without heads following. Russell laughed. "I'm not acting mean. Your dad and I just tease each other." Emma frowned. "No. Dad doesn't tease you. You just say rude stuff and everybody ignores it. If pride were a physical thing, I would have felt it break skin in my chest." Leah looked at Emma, then at Russell, then at her parents. For one impossible second I thought maybe the room would finally tell the truth. Instead Colleen said, too brightly, "Let's not spoil a nice afternoon." That sentence told me more about the Whitakers than any insult Russell ever delivered. Let's not spoil a nice afternoon. Meaning, the peace we can fake is more important than the harm we can name. I stood up, told the kids to grab their things, and said we were leaving. Russell rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Daniel. Don't be dramatic." I turned to him and said, very calmly, "My daughter just showed more honesty in one sentence than you've shown in 10 years. That's not drama. That's clarity." We left to a chorus of half-hearted protests, the usual phrases from people who care more about reconvening than repenting. "Let's talk later." He didn't mean it that way. Everybody's emotional. Don't make this bigger than it is. But it was already that big. It had been that big for a long time. Leah cried when we got home. Not because we left. Because Emma had said aloud what Leah had spent years managing in whispers. After that, we saw her parents less. Birthdays mostly. Select holidays. The children noticed the difference but adapted. Kids are better than adults at accepting healthier arrangements if the adults stop narrating them like tragedies. Russell sent one text the next week, "If your ego needs space, enjoy it." I did not answer. He sent another 2 months later after seeing an article in a regional business journal about Northline's apprenticeship pipeline and our expansion into refrigerated logistics support. "Congrats on the PR, guess even maintenance can market itself now." I didn't answer that either. Silence bothered him more than confrontation ever had. He could wrestle with anger. He could perform around objections. He had no script for becoming irrelevant. By year 10, the distance had become semi-permanent. Leah still spoke to her mother often and to Martin occasionally. Russell remained in the orbit the way bad weather remains in the forecast, present whether you invite it or not. We saw him twice that year in person before the incident that finally snapped something loose for good. The first was at Martin's retirement dinner. He had sold the majority of his company to a larger healthcare distribution group and kept a consultancy seat, which was really just his elegant way of admitting he no longer wanted 60-hour weeks. The dinner was at a private room in a steakhouse that dimmed the lights enough to flatter everyone. Martin gave a measured speech about work, family, gratitude, and legacy. Colleen cried, beautifully as always. Leah held my hand under the table. Emma wore a navy dress and sat straighter than most adults. Miles asked excellent questions about how many trucks had been in Grandpa's fleet at its peak. Russell arrived late. Of course he did. He had just taken what he called a transitional advisory role after his branding agency lost 2 major accounts. He described it like a strategic pivot. It sounded, to anybody who had ever read a severance agreement, like a soft landing with nice nouns. Halfway through dinner, after Martin thanked me publicly for helping him evaluate building systems in some of the warehouses before the sale, Russell lifted his glass and said, to Daniel, proof that in every successful family there's always room for one guy who knows where the breaker panel is. A few people laughed automatically. Martin did not. He set down his fork and said, there's also room for the person in the family who actually knows how to build an operation from scratch. Don't confuse usefulness with smallness, Russell. That's been your mistake for years. I have replayed that moment 100 times. Not because it was perfect. Because it came so late. Russell blinked like somebody had changed the temperature without asking him. Colleen stared at her plate. Leah squeezed my knee under the table so hard it almost hurt. For the first time, the room had not protected him. He recovered quickly, made a joke about Dad getting sentimental in retirement, and moved the conversation along. But I saw something there. A flash of naked dislike. Not just toward me. Toward any reality that no longer organized itself around his superiority. The second time we saw him that year was the worst. It was at Emma's middle school academic awards night. Emma had always been serious about school, not in a frantic grade-chasing way but in a deep, hungry way that made teachers love her. She read constantly. She asked precise questions. She had my patience and Leah's articulation. That night she won a district science scholarship for a renewable energy model project she had spent weeks building on our dining table. Leah had invited her parents. Colleen came. Martin came. Russell showed up 20 minutes late wearing a blazer over a t-shirt, as if education were a venue he was dropping by before the real evening began. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the school commons with cookies, lemonade, and folding tables covered in projects. Emma was explaining her model to Martin when Russell wandered over, glanced at the display board, and said, "Well, look at that. Maybe she'll be the first one in Daniel's branch of the family to make it past wrench-level thinking." He said it with a smile. Miles heard it. Emma heard it. Leah heard it. And something in me, something that had spent a decade telling itself to wait for a cleaner moment, finally stopped negotiating. I stepped closer to him than I ever had before. "You will not talk about my children that way," I said. He smirked, but I saw surprise under it. "Relax." It was a compliment. No. It was the same insult you've been dressing up for 10 years. You don't get to throw my kids into it. The room around us had gone thin and quiet. Not many people could hear every word, but enough could hear the shape of it. Russell spread his hands. "Daniel, if you're feeling insecure at a school event, that's really not on me." Then he leaned in just slightly and said, low enough that only I, Leah, and probably Martin could hear it, "You still don't get it, do you? You can own all the trucks and toolboxes you want. Worthless doesn't mean poor. It means common. Worthless doesn't mean poor. It means common." That was the line. That was the purest version of what he had believed all along. Not that I lacked money. Not that I lacked work ethic. That I lacked rank in the human order he had invented to protect himself. Leah stepped between us before I could answer. She looked at her brother with a face I had never seen her make before. No fear. No pleading. Just disgust. "Leave," she said. He laughed once, sharply. "Oh, don't be ridiculous." I said leave. "If you stay, we go public with every rotten thing you've been doing to this family for years, and I am done softening it for you." Martin said, very quietly, "Russell. Go." This time, he had to. He walked out with that same expensive carelessness he used like armor, but his ears were red and his jaw was jumping. Emma was crying by then, not because she was fragile, but because she had just watched adults stop lying about a tension that had been living in the walls her whole life. That night, after the kids were asleep, Leah sat on the edge of our bed and said, "I am so ashamed of how long I let that continue." I sat beside her. There are moments in marriage where vindication is available but love requires something quieter. So I didn't say yes, you did. I didn't say I needed you earlier. Both were true. I just said, then don't let it continue anymore. And to her credit, she didn't. The next few months were quieter than any period since our wedding. Not easy. Quiet. There is a difference. Leah stopped inviting Russell to anything involving the kids. She told Colleen visits were welcome as long as they were separate from him. Martin accepted that with more grace than I expected. Colleen tried, for a while, to negotiate the old fantasy back into place. Families say things they don't mean, she told Leah on the phone once, not realizing I could hear her from the hallway. Leah answered, "No, Mom. Families say exactly what they mean all the time. The problem is that the rest of us keep pretending otherwise." I loved her for that sentence. I grieved her for needing 10 years to say it. Both emotions lived in me at the same time. Northline hit its biggest growth phase right after the break with Russell, which in another story would look symbolic. It wasn't. The contracts had been in development for months. A regional cold chain operator expanded. 2 medical storage facilities switched to us after a competitor botched response times. Our apprenticeship program was featured in a workforce development panel. We opened a satellite branch in the next county and promoted Omar into a regional operations role he had earned 100 times over. Success felt good. It also felt strangely clean. Without Russell around, I realized how much energy I'd spent not merely tolerating insult, but anticipating it. Removing one chronic source of contempt from your life is like shutting off a machine you forgot was always humming in the next room. You don't notice how loud it was until the silence arrives. One night in early winter, I was in my home office reviewing year-end numbers when Leah came in wearing one of my old college sweatshirts and holding 2 mugs of tea. She set one beside me and looked at the spreadsheets. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Right now? With these margins?" "Yes. Deeply." She smiled, then didn't leave. I turned in the chair. "That's not what you mean." "No." I waited. She sat on the small couch by the wall and folded one leg under herself. "I keep thinking about all the years I asked you to be patient because I thought patience was preserving peace," she said. "And I don't know how to look at that honestly without admitting it was cowardice dressed up as diplomacy. That is one of the bravest things another person ever said to me. Not because it repaired everything instantly. Because it named the real wound." I went and sat beside her. "You were trying to survive your family too," I said. "By asking you to absorb the part one didn't want to face." "Sometimes." Her eyes filled. "Why didn't you force it sooner?" I laughed once, softly, without humor. "Because I loved you. Because I didn't want every holiday with your parents to become a referendum on whether I belonged in your life. Because part of me thought if I just built enough, he'd sound more ridiculous. And because if I'm honest, I was still 28 for a long time. Still hearing that word and wondering whether proving him wrong would finally erase it." She took my hand. "Did it?" "No," I said. "It just made the word look smaller." We started counseling after that. Some people hear that and imagine catastrophe. For us, it was carpentry. Naming the warped beam before the house carries it another decade. Leah and I did the work. We talked about family systems, loyalty, class shame, my habit of swallowing injury until resentment calcified, her habit of mistaking endurance for balance. We got better. Not prettier. Better. And while all that was happening in our house, Russell's life was quietly folding in on itself. The first hints came sideways through Colleen, who could never decide whether she was protecting him or advertising his problems in gentler language. Russell was between opportunities. Russell had been treated unfairly by people who envied his instincts. Russell was consulting independently. Russell had downsized his apartment because he wanted flexibility. Russell was seeing who his real friends were. Translation: if you have ever known a family that worships appearances, job gone, cash tight, network evaporating, pride inflamed. Then Martin called me one Tuesday afternoon and asked if I had 20 minutes to meet him for coffee. He chose a plain diner near one of his old warehouse properties, which told me immediately that he wanted a conversation rather than an atmosphere. Martin never chose plain by accident. He arrived early. He looked older than he had at retirement, not physically so much as structurally. Some men spend decades being obeyed and then age all at once when the work that kept their posture firm disappears. After we ordered, he said, "I'm not asking you for anything today." Whenever someone starts that way, there's always an ask in the room. I nodded and waited. "Russell is in trouble," he said finally. I stirred my coffee once. "What kind of trouble?" "The expensive kind." That almost made me smile. Martin went on. The advisory role had ended. The consulting pipeline Russell kept boasting about was mostly theater. He had debts I won't list because the exact numbers don't matter as much as the shape of them, too many monthly obligations built on an identity that required visible success at all times. A luxury lease. Credit lines. Private school tuition for a daughter from his first marriage. A condo he had refinanced badly because he kept assuming the next deal, the next title, the next rescue would arrive before the bill did. He asked me to cover him again, Martin said. Again? Martin looked down. There it was. The hidden history beneath the swagger. I said nothing. He answered anyway. More than once. Did Colleen know? Not fully. He rubbed his thumb against the coffee mug. I created some of this. I appreciated the sentence. I just didn't let it work too quickly. How? By confusing charm with competence. By subsidizing style. By calling it support when it was really avoidance. I took a breath. Why are you telling me? He met my eyes then. Because if he reaches out to you, I want you to understand the context. And because if he doesn't, I still owed you the truth that he has never stood on his own as securely as he made it sound. That conversation changed something in me. Not toward Russell. Toward memory. It rearranged a decade of insults when I realized many of them had come from a man secretly terrified that he himself had no floor. Again, it did not make him innocent. But it made him legible. A month later, Colleen called Leah in tears because Russell had exploded at Martin during a family dinner we hadn't attended. According to her, Martin finally refused another large bailout and told him he needed to sell the condo, scale down his life, and accept work based on actual ability rather than image. Russell accused him of humiliating him. Martin replied, in what I later heard was an unusually calm voice, that humiliation wasn't the problem, fiction was. That line traveled through the family like weather. Fiction was. Leah repeated it to me in the kitchen and said, he still doesn't get it. He thinks the insult is needing help. He has no idea the insult was what he did to you while needing it all along. Then came Thursday. Actually, the first move came the Tuesday before Thursday. At 8:14 p.m., while I was sitting at the dinner table helping Miles with algebra and pretending not to be impressed that Emma had corrected my pronunciation of a scientist's name from across the room, my phone lit up with a message from a number I had not deleted but had long ago muted. Russell. You free this week? I stared at it. Leah saw my face and said, who is it? I turned the screen toward her. She read it, looked up, and said, you don't owe him anything. I knew that. I also knew some doors open only once. And not always for the reason the person knocking expects. I typed back, depends what this is about. He replied 4 minutes later. Would rather talk in person. There was no brotherly warmth in it. No self-awareness. No apology. Just compressed urgency trying to sound dignified. I told him Thursday at 10:30, office address included, and said, bring your resume if this is about work. That took 17 minutes to answer. Finally, understood. Leah read the exchange and sat very still. Do you want me there? She asked. No. Do you want to do it at all? I thought about that. The honest answer surprised me. Yes, I said. I think I do. Not because I want revenge. Because I want to see whether he can tell the truth if there's no audience to perform for. Leah nodded slowly. If he apologizes, what then? Then I'll decide based on the apology and the work. And if he doesn't? Then he's just unemployed Russell in a nicer chair. Thursday morning, I arrived earlier than usual. Not because I needed more prep. Because I wanted stillness before the meeting. I walked the second floor. Checked in with dispatch. Asked Omar about a compressor replacement at one of the clinics. Reviewed a training budget. Watched two apprentices in the bay argue respectfully over wiring sequence and felt absurdly protective of the environment we'd built. No swagger. No inherited entitlement. Just people trying to become reliable. That mattered. Culture is expensive to build and easy to corrupt. At 10:25, Anna buzzed and said, "He's here." I looked out from the upper interior window that faced reception and saw Russell seated in one of the gray lobby chairs. Navy suit, slightly shiny at the elbows. White shirt. Conservative tie. Haircut shorter than usual. No watch I recognized, which meant either he had sold the expensive ones or decided not to wear them. There was a folder on his lap and the paper cup in his hands. He looked outwardly composed in the way men do when all their control is being spent on posture. From above, he seemed smaller. Not in any theatrical way. Just human-sized. That is another thing contempt steals from people. It makes them look larger in memory than they really were. I let him wait 4 extra minutes. Not as punishment. As calibration. Who is a person when the room does not rush to reassure him? When I finally stepped into reception, he stood too fast and nearly dropped the cup. "Daniel," he said. No joke. No comment. No performance. Just my name. I nodded toward the hallway. "Come on back." My office was simple. Glass on one side facing the operations floor, a desk scarred by actual use, 2 guest chairs, 1 bookcase, a framed photo of Leah and the kids at Lake Michigan, a whiteboard with notes from a planning session, and shelves holding model components Emma once insisted made the place look like Dad's brain turned into furniture. It was not an executive fantasy. It was a working room. Russell noticed everything. Men like him always do when they're entering a status arrangement they don't fully know how to interpret. I sat behind the desk. He sat across from me and placed the folder down with both hands. For a moment neither of us spoke. Rain tapped the glass. Phones rang faintly outside. Somewhere down the hall a printer spit out paperwork with the dutiful impatience of every office machine in history. Russell cleared his throat. "I appreciate you seeing me. You said you wanted to talk." He nodded once. Then he opened the folder and slid a resume toward me, as if I had not already seen the digital version. "I'm looking for something stable," he said. Stable. That word again. 10 years earlier he had treated stability like it belonged only to people born within it. Now he was asking me for some. I asked, stable doing what? He seemed prepared for that. Business development. Client relations. Team leadership. I've managed accounts, negotiated partnerships, overseen revenue growth. All technically phrased. Almost bloodless. I picked up the resume and read from it quietly, not because I needed the information, but because I wanted him to hear how paper sounds when it can no longer bluff. Regional Sales Director. Vice President of Client Strategy. Independent Consultant. Brand Partnerships. Growth Advisory. I set it down. Do you know what we actually need right now? He hesitated. I'm sure there are several areas where my experience could add value. That wasn't the question. Something passed over his face then. Not anger. Recognition. I had used his own old rhythm on him. No, he said. I don't know what you need right now. We need people who can solve problems without pretending they're above them. We need managers who understand operations from the floor up. We need adults who can own mistakes the first time instead of branding them later. He swallowed. Outside my office window, Omar crossed the operations floor with a tablet in one hand and stopped to help one of the new techs interpret a parts diagram. No speech. No performance. Just help. I pointed out toward the floor. See Omar? Russell turned. He's been with me almost from the beginning. He can price a repair, run a team, calm an angry client, unload a truck if he has to, and teach somebody younger without making them feel stupid. That's value here. We have plenty of people who know how to say synergy in a meeting. That market is saturated. Russell exhaled through his nose. I understand I don't come from this industry. No, I said. You don't come from humility. That's the bigger issue. He looked at me sharply then. Good. Truth should have edges. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then, in a voice so controlled I could hear the strain in it, he said, I know I haven't always been fair to you. That was not an apology. It was a legal statement with the liability trimmed off. I leaned back in my chair. Not always. He glanced at the photo of my family, then back at me. Daniel, I was under pressure for a long time. So was I. That's not the same and you know it. I almost laughed. There it was. Even here. Even now. Pressure, in Russell's mind, remained stratified by class. His strain was tragic. Mine was atmospheric. Then explain the difference, I said. He looked cornered by the directness of it. I had expectations, he said finally. From my parents. From my circle. I had a standard to maintain. So you dealt with that by treating me like I contaminated the room? I didn't treat you like that. You called me worthless before my wedding. You called me common in front of my children. You spent 10 years turning my work into a punchline because you thought anything built by hand was beneath you. If you can't even name what you did, why exactly are we having this meeting? His jaw tightened. Then loosened. Then, for the first time since he sat down, he looked tired enough to be honest. Because I need work, he said. Simple. Plain. Finally. I nodded once. That's true. But need doesn't make you employable by itself. He looked away from me and out toward the operations floor again. Maybe he was buying time. Maybe he was seeing, perhaps for the first real time, that the place around him existed whether he respected it or not. I was wrong about you, he said. Better. Still not enough. How? He frowned. What do you mean, how? I mean if you're going to say you were wrong, be specific enough that it costs you something. Otherwise it's just a phrase people use when they want mercy without self-knowledge. That landed. He stared at the desk. His fingers had gone white where they gripped the folder. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. I thought you were temporary, he said. I thought you were one of those men who work hard because they don't know how else to survive, and I assumed that meant you'd stay small. I thought Leah would outgrow you. Then when she didn't, I told myself she had settled emotionally because I couldn't admit you were actually building something more solid than most men I knew. He stopped. Rain ticked against the glass. I waited. And? I said. He shut his eyes briefly. And I looked down on you because you made me feel replaceable. There it was. Not noble. Not elegant. But true enough to matter. People imagine vindication feels explosive. Sometimes it feels quiet. Sometimes it feels like a final puzzle piece sliding into a place you already suspected existed. Replaceable how? I asked. He gave a bitter little laugh. You actually knew how to do things. Fix things. Build things. Endure things. People trusted you. My whole life I was rewarded for seeming capable. You kept becoming capable in ways nobody could fake. I hated that. The honesty in the room changed after that. It did not become warm. It became usable. I folded my hands. "Do you want a title," I asked, "or do you want work?" He looked at me. A long, wary look. "I need income," he said. "But I also need a path back." Back to what? He didn't answer. Because he knew the honest version sounded ugly. Back to looking like himself again. Back to not being frightened at 3 in the morning. Back to a mirror he recognized. I stood and walked to the glass wall overlooking the floor. He turned in his chair to follow me. "You know what my first year looked like?" I said. "I know you don't, not really, because you were too busy narrating it from a distance. So let me help you." I answered calls in parking lots while eating crackers from vending machines. I did estimates from gas stations. I came home too tired to speak and went back out because a freezer alarm doesn't care whether you're proud. Leah stretched grocery money. I missed sleep, comfort, and plenty of ego. But every ugly part of it built something. Not just revenue. Structure. Skill. Character. I turned back toward him. "You mocked all of that because you thought visible ease was evidence of superiority. It isn't. It's often just evidence that somebody else carried the load." He looked like he wanted to defend himself, then didn't. Good again. A crack where the truth can enter is more useful than a polished lie. I came back to the desk and sat down. "Here's what I can offer," I said. His whole body went still. "Not because we're family. Family would actually be a reason to say no. I'm offering it because I believe people can work their way into honesty if they stop performing long enough. But understand this very clearly, I am not hiring the version of you that spent 10 years talking down to me. That man is useless here." He nodded once, cautiously. "We need a junior operations coordinator for the West Branch. Scheduling support, client follow-up, documentation, field communication, vendor confirmations, overflow dispatch, and whatever ugly work the day actually produces. You would report to Omar. You would start on probation. You would arrive before 7. You would learn the systems from the ground up. No private office. No leadership title. No managing people on day 1. You would earn trust the same way everyone else here earns it, through reliability, not vocabulary." He blinked. I kept going. "The salary is honest, not glamorous. Enough to live, not enough to posture. If you do well for a year, we can revisit responsibilities. If you speak to anyone here the way you've spoken to me for the past decade, you're done that hour. If you think any task is beneath you, you're done that hour. And before your first day, if you choose to accept this, you will sit down with Leah and with my children and apologize without excuses for the way you've spoken about me in front of them. Not a performance. Not a summary. A real apology." He stared at me as if I had set an entirely new language on the desk between us. "Operations coordinator," he repeated. "Yes. Reporting to Omar." "Yes. And you think I'd take that?" I held his gaze. "I think that depends on whether you want work or hierarchy. One of those can save you. The other is what got you here." He looked away fast. In that moment I saw the entire war inside him. Not because I pitied him, though a part of me did. Because pride is easy to recognize when you've spent years building a life without the luxury of much of it. He stood up and walked to the office window, hands on his hips, then dragged one palm over his mouth. Below us, a tech in a reflective jacket crossed the floor carrying a compressor housing while another held the door. 2 dispatchers were bent over a route board. Anna laughed at something someone said near reception. The place was alive in the ordinary, disciplined way real operations are alive. Nothing cinematic. Everything necessary. Russell said, without turning around, "You really believe this place matters that much, don't you?" "I don't believe it. I know it." Ask the clinic whose vaccines stay usable because we answer at 2 in the morning. Ask the food warehouse that doesn't lose 6 figures because our team caught a failing condenser before dawn. Ask the apprentices who bought their first decent apartment because someone finally paid them to become good at something real. He turned back. His face had changed. Not softened. Stripped. And you built all this? I almost said, no, we built it. But sometimes the singular matters. I started it, I said. And then I hired people better than my ego. That's how things last. He let out a breath that sounded half like surrender. Then he sat down again. I need a minute, he said. I nodded. I gave it to him. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher. I don't know if I can walk into a room and be the least important person in it. There was no sarcasm in that sentence. No disguise. Just fear, finally introduced by its real name. Then learn, I said. Most adults should. He looked down at his hands. I was cruel to you, he said. I didn't rescue him from the discomfort. Yes. I said things because I thought if I put you low enough, I could stay high without actually becoming better. Also yes. He gave one bleak nod, as if every honest sentence took material off the bones. I don't know how to explain this without sounding pathetic, he said, but there were years I watched Leah with you and hated how safe she seemed. Not bored. Not dazzled. Safe. And I told myself that couldn't possibly be enough for a smart woman. I think I needed to believe that because if what you were offering was enough, then maybe all the performance in my life was just noise. That may have been the truest thing he said the entire morning. Because underneath class snobbery, underneath image, underneath all the polished contempt, what Russell could never forgive me for was this: I had built a life around substance and people had loved me in it. No costume required. He sat there, smaller than the version of him I had carried for a decade, and asked, almost carefully, if I say yes, are you going to spend the rest of my life making me feel this? I answered immediately. No. I don't need to. The work will either change you or expose you. My feelings are irrelevant to that process. And I meant it. Revenge is overrated when competence can do the job better. He closed the folder. Then opened it again. Then closed it for good. Can I think about it until tomorrow? He asked. Of course. He nodded once, stood, and then paused with one hand on the chair back. Daniel. Yes. He did not look fully at me when he said it. Maybe shame still has a posture. I am sorry. For all of it. Especially in front of your kids. Especially because part of me always knew exactly what I was doing. There. At last. Not perfect. But owned. I watched him long enough to see whether he would add a justification. He didn't. Thank you, I said. That was all. He left my office carrying the same folder, but he held it differently now, like it contained actual paper instead of a costume. From the window I watched him cross reception. Anna smiled politely. He nodded. He paused by the front doors and glanced back once, not dramatically, not with resentment, just with the expression of someone realizing that another person's ordinary life had become the bridge over a ravine he had spent years mocking. Then he went out into the rain. I sat alone for a while after that. Not triumphant. Steady. There is a kind of victory that feels loud and temporary, built for retelling. And there is another kind that feels almost private, even when the whole story would sound satisfying to everyone else. The second kind mattered more to me. Because the point was never to watch Russell kneel. The point was to stop kneeling internally to a definition of worth that had never deserved my obedience. The next morning he called at 9:07. I let it ring once before answering. It's me, he said unnecessarily. I know. A pause. Then, I'll take it. Not I would be honored. Not thank you for the chance. Just the simplest version of surrender he could manage. All right, I said. Then the other conditions stand. Another pause. I know. We set the apology meeting for Sunday afternoon at our house. If you have never watched a proud man walk into a room where children are among the people he has wronged, you may not understand how much smaller adulthood can suddenly become. Russell arrived without the armor this time. No theatrical outfit. No expensive coat. Just dark slacks, a plain sweater, and the posture of someone who had discovered that shame weighs more than style. Leah answered the door. She did not hug him. She let him in. Emma and Miles were in the living room with me. I had told them enough truth to prepare them without turning them into referees. Your uncle needs to apologize for the way he has spoken to me and around you. You do not have to comfort him. You do not have to perform forgiveness. You just have to listen and say what is true for you. Emma, at 13, took that exactly the way I expected, seriously, with eyebrows slightly narrowed as if emotional integrity were a science fair category she'd been assigned to judge. Miles, younger and softer but no less perceptive, kept rubbing the seam of a couch pillow between his fingers. Russell stood in front of them and looked, for 1 second, like he might try to improvise his way out of honesty. Then he must have remembered my office. He sat down across from the kids and said, "I've talked about your dad in ways I should never have talked about anyone, especially in front of you. I made fun of his work, where he came from, the kind of person he is. I acted like those things made him less important. They don't. I was wrong, and I hurt him, and I hurt you by saying those things where you could hear them. I'm sorry." Emma looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Why did you do it?" The question hit him harder than any accusation could have. Because children ask from the center. He could not hide behind jargon with her. Because I was proud in a bad way, he said slowly. And insecure in a bad way. And I took that out on your dad because he had things I didn't know how to respect. Emma nodded once, thinking. Miles asked, "Do you still think Dad is common?" Russell closed his eyes briefly. "No," he said. "I think I used that word because I was afraid of what it said about me, that people trusted him more than they trusted me." That answer, imperfect as it was, seemed to matter to Miles. He didn't smile. He didn't absolve him. But he stopped worrying the pillow seam. Leah stood by the mantel with her arms crossed, tears in her eyes that never fell. After the kids went upstairs, she faced her brother alone. "I spent years asking my husband to carry what should have been my boundary," she said. "I won't do that anymore. You will not speak about him like that ever again. Not in a joke. Not in a story. Not in one of those little polished cuts you pretend aren't knives. If you do, you're gone from our lives. Fully." Russell nodded. For once he did not defend himself against the firmness of a woman in his family. Maybe desperation had taught him what love had not. He started the following Monday. At 6:53 in the morning, I watched from the West Branch lot as he stepped out of a practical used sedan that looked unfamiliar in the best possible way. No lease statement. No luxury disguise. Just transportation. Omar met him at the side entrance with a badge, a basic handbook, and the expression of a man who had been briefed thoroughly and was willing to let reality make the next introduction. I had told Omar the truth in private. Not every ugly detail. Enough. He listened, arms folded, then said, "So he gets the same shot as anybody else, minus the chance to act slick." Exactly. Omar had grinned. Good. Slick's useless by 9 a.m. around here anyway. The first week was brutal for Russell in ways nobody outside work would have understood. Not because anyone mistreated him. Because nobody rearranged the workplace around his self-image. He had to learn software he once would have dismissed as admin work. He had to confirm technician routes, log service notes accurately, call vendors who did not care about his old titles, and sit in morning huddles where the most respected voices belonged to people with grease under their nails and sharp memories for operational detail. He made mistakes. Lots of them. He mislabeled 2 urgent parts orders. He forgot that field timing is not the same as conference room timing. He tried, on day 3, to recommend a client-facing escalation strategy with enough polished language to wallpaper a law office, and Omar cut him off mid-sentence. Say it in plain English, Omar told him. If the building is warm and the cooler's down, nobody wants your corporate poetry. Tell me what broke, who goes there, what it costs, and what we need next. Russell flushed. Then he started again. Plainly. And to his credit, he kept starting again. That mattered. Not talent. Not background. Willingness. 3 weeks in, I stopped by the West Branch just before lunch and found him at the dispatch counter on the phone with a facilities manager whose warehouse had lost partial refrigeration overnight. Russell was listening carefully, taking notes, asking precise questions, and not once trying to sound more important than the problem. When he hung up, he looked up and saw me. For half a second embarrassment flashed across his face, as if he assumed I had arrived specifically to measure him in his reduced form. I hadn't. But I understood why he thought that. Client calmed down once we gave them actual time windows, he said. Good, I replied. He nodded toward the route board. I didn't realize how much of this business is trust under pressure. I almost said, I know. Instead I said, most real businesses are. He let that sit. Then, quietly, he said, I used to think visible confidence was what made people follow you. Sometimes it does, I said. For a month. Maybe a year. But when something expensive breaks at the wrong hour, people follow the person who can stay useful. He looked at the board again and gave a small nod, as if some internal translation was still underway. That afternoon, driving back to the main office, I thought about what the last decade had actually taught me. Not the easy lesson everybody wants from stories like this. Not the fantasy that if you work hard enough, the people who mocked you will crawl back and make you feel whole. That part is temporary. Even satisfying moments fade. The harder lesson is this: if you let someone else define your value long enough, you can become highly accomplished and still emotionally obedient to a lie. I had built a company, raised children, kept promises, carried payroll, answered emergencies, and created livelihoods for other families. Yet some part of me had still been standing in that alley behind the rehearsal dinner hearing a man with softer hands explain my worth to me. It took more than success to leave that alley. It took naming the lie. It took Leah finally refusing to decorate it. It took my children hearing enough truth to reject it. And, strangely, it took Russell himself walking into my office asking for work, because there are moments when reality puts its full weight on the story somebody has been telling about you and crushes it flat. A month after he started, Emma asked whether Uncle Russell was still working for me. For Northline, I corrected. She smiled. Okay. For Northline. Is he better? I thought about that. He's more honest, I said. That's where better starts. She accepted that immediately, the way children do when an answer doesn't insult their intelligence. Later that same evening, Leah found me in the garage pretending to organize tools when really I was just enjoying a quiet half-hour alone. She leaned against the workbench and said, "Do you regret hiring him?" I set down the wrench in my hand. "No," I said. But not because he deserved it. Because I wanted the decision to come from who I am now, not who he tried to convince me I was. She stepped closer. "Who are you now?" I looked around the garage at shelves I had built, bicycles half-tipped against the wall, a cooler for Miles's soccer games, Emma's old science project still somehow surviving in the corner, and the woman who had loved me imperfectly but honestly enough to learn. Then I said, "A man who knows being underestimated and being small are not the same thing." That night, for the first time in years, I dreamed about the rehearsal dinner and woke up without anger. Just distance. Which might be the closest thing to freedom most of us ever get.